Good afternoon and welcome to our second COVID-19 legal briefing. My name is Sarah Rose and I am the Assistant Director of GW Law Alumni Relations. These virtual webinars were set up by GW Law to hear from members of our faculty about the effects of the pandemic on their particular legal fields of research and practice. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Joan Meier. Joan Meier is a professor of clinical law and director of the National Family Violence Law Center at George Washington University Law School. Joan has been a clinical law professor for 29 years at GW Law, where she founded 3 pioneering and nationally recognized interdisciplinary domestic violence clinical programs. She has published widely on domestic violence, custody, and various Supreme Court decisions. Her major study of child custody outcomes in cases involving parental alienation and abuse allegations, funded by the National Institute of Justice, was recently completed. Its findings have been written about in multiple media, including scholarly articles, The Washington Post, and The New Yorker. Her scholarship addresses domestic violence and family law, social science and court, domestic violence and criminal procedure, and clinical teaching. In August 2019, Joan stepped down from the Domestic Violence Legal Empowerment and Appeals Project, DV-LEAP, the nonprofit she founded in 2003 to provide pro bono appeals in domestic violence cases. While at DV-LEAP, Joan filed 11 amicus briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court and 3 party briefs. She also represented Friends of the Court and survivors of domestic violence in state court appeals all over the country. DV-LEAP's cases involved custody and child protection enforcement of civil protection orders, criminal prosecution of batterers, and other issues. Joan has provided trainings for judges, psychologists, lawyers, domestic violence coalitions, and other best practices in adjunction of domestic violence and family court litigation. Joan and DV-LEAP have received several awards, including, among others, the American Bar Association's first ever Sharon Corbett Award for Exceptional Service and Leadership in Improving the Legal Response to Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, and Sexual Assault and/or Stalking, and the Outstanding Leadership Award for Justice for Children in 2007. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1980, cum laude from the University of Chicago Law School in 1983, and clerked on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. Professor Meier, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you as our second guest speaker in the COVID-19 Legal Briefing webinar series with GW Law faculty.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. It's an interesting opportunity and an honor.
Perfect. To start, can you tell us a bit about your research prior to COVID-19?
Oh, yeah. As you mentioned, I've become more and more focused over the last 5 to 10 years on what is going wrong for survivors of family violence, whether it's adult domestic violence or child abuse, in court cases involving child custody. And the reason for that is that most of the calls and cases that came into DV-LEAP when I was doing appellate work there were from protective parents, mostly mothers, who were finding that courts would not listen to their concerns about a father's dangerousness, and in fact, sometimes punishing the mothers for raising those concerns and even taking custody away and giving it to the father. And that is something that I was spending a lot of time doing trainings on and writing about and doing appellate work on. And I became concerned that no matter how much we talked about the problems and the concerns, it wasn't really making a difference. So I decided to gather some objective data because there was none at the time. And so over the last 5 years or so, I'd been very focused on that study, which was federally funded, to look at what was coming out in terms of outcomes in family court cases that involved abuse claims and what's called parental alienation claims, which is a pseudoscientific notion that is often used to deny abuse claims by mothers. So the study focused on those kinds of allegations, and a lot of my writing and trainings and presentations since then have been on what's on the empirical findings of that study and the problems in family court.
Thank you for that information. To dive into COVID-19, how have COVID-19 stay-at-home orders and other policies affected the field of domestic violence and the people who are at risk?
Well, I'll get back to the family court issue in a minute, but the first sort of the broader picture, as I think everyone probably knows at this point, is that the quarantine has been incredibly dangerous for people in abusive relationships, both adults and children. For instance, the main domestic violence charity in the United Kingdom, Refuge, reported that their calls surged by 66% after quarantine went into effect. France reported police, and they get less calls than charities. Police in France reported 30% surge in calls. China, there was a huge surge in calls for help. So we know domestic violence is surging generally for all kinds of reasons, but one of which is that people are pressed up together, people are very stressed, people are losing their jobs, and victims have no place to go to escape victimization. Interestingly, when I was looking for data on the US, I found that we don't have really good data yet, but there's a mix of information coming out. One thing is that there are not fewer calls, but there's only a slight surge in calls. And one reason we think is that it's so hard for women, which is usually the victims are women, usually victims of men. So I will speak in gendered stereotypes because they tend to capture the majority of the picture. They can't make the call because they don't have enough privacy to do so safely. The abuser can hear them calling. So sometimes they're calling and whispering, or they're simply not calling. That is one problem, at least for adults. And the other thing that we know is that child abuse calls have plummeted. And that, of course, is because most child abuse reports have historically come from what are called mandated reporters, professionals who are in the lives of the children, like teachers or counselors or doctors. And since children are not in contact with these people anymore, those reports aren't being made. But sadly, some anecdotal reports suggest that more severe child abuse injuries and harms are showing up in emergency rooms. So I also found that there's been more reports by children themselves, specifically of sexual assault, to the National Sexual Assault Hotline. So it seems that there may be more child sexual assault going on, similarly to there being more domestic violence going on, because everybody is sort of stuck and it's hard to get away. There's more I could say, but I'll stop here.
Thank you. So what are some of the preparedness and response plans for COVID-19 that domestic violence advocates are implementing?
Well, I've been really impressed with the DC domestic violence community, which has always been a very strong community. And that's thanks in part to the fact that we have so many law schools here with great domestic violence clinics, including our own Professor Cohn's Family Justice Litigation Clinic here at GW. And together with some really great NGOs who do domestic violence work here, they put together a whole remote system for the filing of petitions for protection orders, worked with the courts to get that up and running, have been working with the courts on remote hearings, which I think have started recently. And there's a very good communication between the court and the DV community because there's a very professional relationship there, and everybody knows that these resources need to be available. So I know that Professor Cohn had her students, before the semester ended, had her students helping victims file remote petitions. They were basically on a hotline receiving those calls and assisting. So I think at least here they've been very creative. I've heard less good things about Maryland, which has a less strong domestic violence professional network than DC does. And I'm sure that it's a patchwork around the country.
Thank you for that information. Can you also discuss how COVID-19 has affected child custody arrangements, particularly with domestic violence victims who share a child with an abuser?
Right. Thanks for that question. So that, of course, because I focus so much on what's happening with shared parenting with abusers, that's my particular interest in the COVID situation. And I've been starting to collect stories from around the country. And I don't yet have a quantitative sense, but qualitatively, I'm getting the sense that certainly abusers, or whether or not they've been adjudicated an abuser in the past, people who are very hostile to their partners are making motions to use COVID to cut off the partner from their children. So for instance, we know of a number of fathers who have filed motions to cut off the mother's access to her children because she works in healthcare or works in some other essential employee position. We've seen some men have kicked their wives out of the house because they work in that kind of a position on the claim that they're not safe for the children. Some women have also filed motions to protect the children during COVID from what's going on at the father's house when they have had information suggesting that the father and or whoever else the father hangs out with is not respecting social distancing and CDC recommendations for safety. And often you have children, they're kind of like a carrier back and forth of the potentially of the disease from one house to another. And in some of these cases, the concerned home has an older generation, a grandparent in the house, or someone, whether it's the parent themselves or the kid themselves, with a vulnerability or a compromised immunity situation. And so you have courts fielding motions, but you also have people taking self-help. In particular, what I've seen, and again, I probably see a biased sample, but I've seen fathers taking self-help and saying, nope, I'm not going to send the kids until this is over, or until you stop whatever you're doing, or whatever. So it's really a disaster, and you can kind of see that the patterns that we were seeing in family courts before, where abusers were not being held accountable and in fact were winning custody, are being potentially exacerbated now, and COVID is becoming essentially another weapon for abusive parents to use against their adult victims, and children, as usual, are caught in the middle and potentially at risk. So I'm hoping to collect more stories, and if any of our listeners today know of stories, I'd love it if they would send them on to me online or to the alumni, whatever is accessible, because I'm going to be writing an essay and submitting it for publication about how this area has taken shape during COVID and what's happening, and whether the family court patterns we've seen before are evident now during COVID.
Professor Meier, can you tell us a little more about the Domestic Violence Project Clinic and the opportunities and needs for potential placements in community organizations in the area of domestic violence, legal advocacy due to COVID?
Absolutely. So my clinic, I've taught 3 over the many years I've been at GW, but my current and most recent clinic that's been for the last 16 years is the Domestic Violence Project. And that's been modeled so that I could teach it without teaching full time and not directly supervising students. So I have students placed in the field working with domestic violence legal organizations, a wide spectrum, including civil legal assistance, criminal prosecution, immigration work, legislative and policy work, Title IX work, etc. And they work there, and then the clinic consists of a weekly seminar and regular journals and small group meetings, etc., which I will be continuing next fall. But what's been challenging, of course, as COVID hit, is that the placements all went to remote work like the rest of the world when the quarantine was issued. And so the students who were working at various places, including prosecutors' offices and others, were now working remotely and no longer able to meet with clients or survivors or colleagues and supervisors. But I was impressed to see that a lot of the placements continued that work, and in fact are continuing that work over the summer. Several of my students who worked at civil legal assistance organizations are being continued over the summer. So I know that the remote work is working for interns as well as for supervisors and NGOs. I think that the prosecutors' offices are also continuing remote work over the summer, potentially some with interns as well. And so I think, like the rest of the world and the rest of the legal world, we are all learning how to do our jobs and our work and our advocacy through remote mechanisms. And it's very interesting to see this massive paradigm shift in how we do what we do to an online venue. But I'm kind of encouraged by the way the placements have worked with the students, and the students have felt very gratified by that, but also by what I'm seeing among the faculty at GW Law, because we're all working very hard and getting a lot of expert input and training on how to become good online teachers, to the extent, it's still not known how much we'll be doing that next year, but to the extent that that's going to be needed, especially for some of us who are more vulnerable to the virus, we're all really working to learn all over again from scratch how to teach law in a new way. And I'm there's a certain gratification, even though this is really challenging and it's a huge burden on top of whatever else we thought we were going to be doing this summer. Really great to see everyone stepping up and meeting the challenge and invested in a very enthusiastic way and very committed to the students and doing the best we can for our students.
Great. Shifting the gears here a little bit, are there ways that our audience can help current students with career connections or job opportunities?
There are, Sarah, but I'm going to ask you to fill in what I'm not going to remember of what we've talked about. We are definitely asking alums and other people in the GW network to send in any openings, whether they're paid or unpaid, to the alumni office and the career office, because many students were not able to keep paid employment that they thought they had for the summer and are looking for whatever they can get that will be a good learning experience. And there are other things which I'm going to turn back to you, Sarah, to describe.
Sure, no problem. To give a little more information, the Career Center would appreciate any full-time or part-time job leads, and we'll also be sending a follow-up email from the Alumni Relations Department after this webinar to give you more information and contact information for the Career Center. And I have another question for you, Professor Meier. If someone can't help with job opportunities now, are there other ways that the GW Law community can assist?
Well, I'm really, really impressed to learn that an incredibly generous donor has pledged, am I right that it's $100,000, to match up to $100,000 of any donations that come in to support GW Law students who need financial support during the virus. And that's an incredible commitment on the part of some amazing GW affiliated person. And I hope that the alumni community will respond to that call, and perhaps the faculty and other connected parts of the network. I don't know if there's something else you want to add to that, Sarah.
Sure. Another initiative that we just started is called 20 for 20. It's an opportunity to share some inspirational words for the GW Law class of 2020. And an email will also go out where you can complete a Google form that allows you to put up to 20 words to share your message with the GW Law class of 2020.
Right. And I think all of those words of encouragement and financial support and all these signs of encouragement are incredibly important and helpful for students who are really facing, not just the difficulty of learning online and all of that, but a very scary employment situation and a certain degree of implosion of the entire economy, which includes the legal economy. And it's a staggering challenge, I think, for people coming out of law school right now. So I think all of the moral support as well as concrete support that we can provide for young grads or soon-to-be grads is incredibly deeply appreciated and important.
Great. And we're going to wrap up our presentation here, but I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Meier, for sharing your thoughts with the GW community. I appreciate your willingness to answer questions, and I wish you the best over the next few summer months. And I also wanted to thank Mike Briggs from our GW Law IT department. Without his assistance, this webinar could not be possible. And lastly, I want to thank our GW Law community for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your attendance at all virtual webinars and encourage you to attend future webinars. And as I mentioned before, a follow-up email will be sent out with additional details about our programming. And I hope that you all stay safe and well and have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone.